In the fall of 2015, I made myself a beautiful new pedal board, which you can see in this video here. I loved that project and it's gotten tons of views here on YouTube, but I realized that it was just too big. I'm going to keep that pedal board around, but I am also going to make a new pedal board that's a lot smaller and much easier to transport around. Another thing that many people who watched the video mentioned is that it required a lot of tools and a lot of expertise. So this new pedal board build is much simpler. In fact, the only power tools it requires are a table saw and a miter saw. As I said, one of the goals for the new pedal board was to make it easily transportable. So I started with this aluminum tool case, which you can find at many of the big box stores like Home Depot. I took down some measurements, and that gave me the overall size that I could make this new pedal board. For this build, I wanted to use some simple materials that I had on hand, so I started with a big piece of scrap poplar. I ripped it down into 2 equal width strips, and then started marking it up from there to cut into the side and front and back rails. So I marked off the size that I would need for the front rails first, and cut those as a pair so they'd be exactly the same length. Next, I cut the side rails, and those I made a little bit longer because my goal was to join these pieces together with miter joints. So you can see as I move over to the case here that the front and back rails fit just inside the case. Side rails are a little bit long because those are going to get joined to the front and back rails with 45-degree miters. So I cut all of those miters here at the miter saw and then moved on to the next step of the build. Before gluing these pieces together, I knew that I wanted to make the front rail shorter and have the side rails angle up to meet the back piece. That would give the pedal board a nice angle for the pedals to sit at. So I ripped the front panel down to size and then marked the angle between the front and back onto one of the side rails. I used a sled here on the table saw to hold that piece at exactly the correct angle and make that cut safely. If you don't have a table saw sled, it's a fantastic tool and allows you to do cuts like that much more safely than you could otherwise. Once I had cut one of the side rails at that angle, I used it to mark out the same angle on the other side, and then took that back to the table saw, mounted it to the sled, and cut it down to the same angle as well. This isn't strictly necessary. You could make this pedal board design so that the front and back are the exact same size and make this a simpler build, but I chose to do that. I used some pieces of reclaimed veneered plywood for the shelves that would go between each rail, which is where the pedals would ultimately sit. In order to place these, I decided to make dados in the side rails. Dados are just slots for something else to fit into. So I took the piece that I knew I was going to use and used that to mark the part of the side rail that I would cut out. I marked that there on each end and across the top, and then used my table saw sled to slowly notch away or nibble away that empty piece. There are lots of ways that you could do that kind of cut. This one just worked the best for me. I then repeated that same process of using the shelf to mark the other part on the rail where another shelf would need to sit. For this one, I marked on the opposite side so that when I went to the table saws, I could put that down on the sled and hold it in a way that was much more safe instead of having that long end sticking out over the table saw blade. I did the same thing for both side rails since they'd each need a slot for the shelves to fit into, and then it was time to glue up the outer frame. I used glue on each of the corners, and then a series of clamps to hold it in place. I initially started off using some bar clamps to try to hold this together, but what I quickly realized was that the most efficient way to do this would actually be with a band or strap clamp. If you don't have one of these and you make any projects that join together with miter joints, I would definitely recommend picking one of those up. It allows you to wrap all the way around the frame and hold everything in place. I also knew that the shelves themselves would provide a lot of strength, so I wasn't as worried about the strength on those miter joints, because it's not the strongest type of joint, but having these shelves that span the width and get glued into place really provides a lot of strength for this board. And in practice over the last 6 months, it's been perfectly strong and been great. So here you can see me gluing those shelves down in place. Each one of those got glue in the dado, and then the shelf simply got set into place and clamped down to hold it while the glue set up. Here you can see the band clamp in place, and like I said, this ultimately proved to be definitely the easiest way to hold everything together as the glue setup. Once the glue was dry, I was able to take the clamps off and move on to the next step, which was starting to trim off those side pieces. Here I'm using a Japanese pole saw. I gave it a light sanding all the way around, including sanding some of the finish off of those shelves. I taped that part off because ultimately those would get Velcro all the way across for the pedals to actually mount to. I didn't want to try to mount the Velcro to a surface that had finish applied to it, so taping these off allowed me to apply finish to the rest of the frame without getting it on the shelves themselves. So I taped that off and then applied several light coats of spray polyurethane to the rest of the frame. The next step was to apply some industrial strength Velcro across the width of both of the shelves. I've used this for many, many years on building pedal boards, and I've always been incredibly impressed by how strong it is. One thing here is to make sure that you give the Velcro plenty of time to adhere to the surface before you start testing it, so that the glue, the adhesive backing of the Velcro, has a chance to set up and really make a good bond before you start stressing it by putting pedals on and taking them off. Here I'm applying it in several strips across the entire thing, and I gave this lots of time, and then I trimmed off the ends to make sure that everything looked nice and neat. Once that was done, I could start putting pedals on and thinking about how I wanted to arrange things. The fact that there's space between the two rails, as well as space underneath the rails, means that mounting pedals and things like power and audio cabling are pretty simple. In order to give the pedalboard case a little bit more flair, I put my stencil on top and sprayed it on just to add my name on the top there. You can see that the board fits into that case perfectly. It drops right in. One thing that I will do sometimes is put some foam in the top of the case, just to make sure that all the pedals stay in place firmly. This has been a really great addition to my guitar rig, and if you build this, I hope it works well for you as well. Thanks for watching.